On a warm evening in July of 2015, the cul-de-sac on Willow Bend Court looked like every other summer night in the small town of Brookdale. Children's laughter echoed between houses, sprinklers hissed across manicured lawns, and the air smelled faintly of barbecue. 9-year-old Caleb Merrick, small for his age but full of energy, darted between the parked cars and hedges, counting loudly as the neighborhood kids scattered. It was a game they'd played 100 times before, hide and seek, with the entire street as their playground. Caleb wore his favorite blue hoodie despite the heat, the sleeves pushed up, and he carried a small plastic flashlight even though the sun was still high enough to keep the sidewalks bright. At 7:15 p.m., his mother, Andrea, stepped out onto their porch and called his name, telling him dinner was ready. She expected the familiar pounding of sneakers on pavement, the burst of excitement as he raced in, still half in the mindset of the game. But the sound never came. She called again, her voice carrying farther this time, but still nothing. From her vantage point, she could see 2 of the other children emerging from their hiding spots, giggling and out of breath, asking if the game was over. Andrea assumed Caleb had simply picked a particularly clever spot, maybe under a deck or behind a shed. She smiled at the thought, until minutes began to slip by. By 7:25, the last of the kids had been found, but Caleb wasn't among them. His friends fanned out, checking their usual hiding places, laughing at first, calling his name in the teasing sing-song that only kids use. But the laughter thinned as they realized he wasn't answering. Andrea joined in the search, moving quickly from yard to yard, glancing under trampolines, pulling open side gates. Caleb's father, Mark, arrived home from work just before 7:40, confused to see neighbors looking in bushes and behind garbage bins. When Andrea told him Caleb hadn't come in, the light in his expression shifted. The Merricks lived in the kind of place where people left their garage doors open during the day, where kids roamed freely from one yard to the next without anyone thinking twice. That night, that openness felt suddenly vulnerable. By 8 p.m., the sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac. Flashlights appeared in hands, first the ones the kids carried as part of the game, then the heavier ones from parents' toolboxes. Every driveway was lit by sweeping beams of light. Neighbors who had been inside came out to help. Doors opened, voices rose. Andrea knocked on one door after another, her tone edging into urgency. Mark checked the wooded strip that ran behind the row of houses, his shoes crunching through underbrush. Caleb had been taught not to go into the woods without an adult, but it was the only place left nearby that offered any kind of cover. He called for his son until his voice caught, listening for any sound and reply. Twigs snapping, a rustle, even a faint cry. Nothing. By 8:20, someone suggested calling the police. Andrea hesitated for only a second before making the call. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled onto the street, its headlights sweeping across the gathered group. The officer took a quick statement, asking when Caleb had last been seen, what he was wearing, if he had a phone. Andrea answered mechanically, her mind replaying the image of him just hours earlier, sitting at the kitchen counter, grinning with a mouthful of peanut butter sandwich. The officer relayed details over the radio, and soon more units arrived, along with a K-9 team. The dogs were given one of Caleb's shirts from his bedroom. They circled the cul-de-sac, noses low, pulling handlers toward the alleyway that separated the Merrick's home from the next street over. The scent trail led them to the gravel path behind the houses, and then, abruptly, it was gone. The handlers looked at each other, murmuring something Andrea couldn't hear. She asked if that meant Caleb had gotten into a car. No one answered her directly. As the light drained from the sky, searchers fanned out in pairs, covering the playground 2 blocks away, the open field near the elementary school, even the drainage ditch at the far end of the neighborhood. Someone brought out a bullhorn. Caleb's name echoed over the rooftops, carrying into the darkness. More neighbors joined, some in pajamas, holding flashlights or lanterns. Parents pulled their own children inside, locking doors they hadn't bothered with in years. By 10 p.m., the quiet suburban street had transformed into the center of an emergency operation. Police cars lined the curb. Officers moved methodically, knocking on every door, checking basements, garages, and garden sheds. Andrea sat on the curb outside her house, her hands shaking, watching the street where Caleb had been running just hours before. She kept expecting him to appear, dusty, grinning, ready to explain where he'd been. Instead, the only movement came from officers walking back and forth, shaking their heads. When midnight came, the street was still awake, lit by the glow of flashlights and the rotating red and blue of the patrol cars. The game had ended hours ago, but its rules seemed to linger in the air. Caleb hiding, everyone else searching. Only now it wasn't pretend, and somewhere, in the space between those last minutes of daylight and the darkness that followed, he had vanished. It would be the last night anyone would see him alive, or at all. The first patrol car arrived just after dusk, headlights sweeping across Willow Bend Court and a crowd already gathered under porch lights. Side gates stood open. Neighbors pointed toward the thin belt of trees behind the houses. Andrea and Mark Merrick gave the officer the simple version, because the simple version was all they had. Their 9-year-old had been playing hide-and-seek and hadn't come in for dinner. Uniformed officers did the thing they always do. They shrank the unknown. They worked outward from the Merrick home in neat rings, clearing anything with a door that could close. Garages gave up tool benches and lawn gear. Basements surrendered closets and storage tubs. Garden sheds, some locked and some warped by heat, were opened and checked. A neighbor slid a canoe so an officer could see beneath it. No one found a place where a child could still be hiding and not be seen. The K-9 unit pulled in, and the murmurs along the block thinned. A handler asked for something recently worn. Andrea brought a T-shirt from her son's desk chair. The dog inhaled and leaned into the leash. Its path sketched the obvious route, from the Merrick's yard to the sidewalk, past the hedge where kids like to disappear, along the curb by the basketball hoop, then to the alley behind the fences. The handler called each turn for the officer beside him, while the dog hugged the boards and tugged through gravel dust. Detectives parked at the far end and moved with deliberate slowness. One measured the distance between back gates and noted how someone could slip half the block without ever stepping into a front yard. A third stood at the alley and traced sight lines. What windows faced the path, what didn't, where a car could idle unseen. The dog's pull along the alley grew insistent, then faltered. The handler circled, let the lead play out, and tried again. 2, 3 passes ended the same way, at a utility pull-off where the gravel widened and the alley met the tree line. Beyond that, the scent thinned to nothing. The handler switched dogs and repeated the track with the same result. It suggested a transition, soil to stone, shade to open air, or something more decisive, like rubber and steel. No one said the words, but the idea was there. By 9, the canvas widened in every direction. Officers went door to door with a one-page handout printed in a cruiser. School photo, height, clothes, last seen at 7:15 p.m. They asked questions that sound standard until you have to answer them. Visitors tonight, a car idling, a gate closed that is usually left open. Several residents said they had cameras on porches and driveways. A list was started. One neighbor scrolled recent clips on a laptop. Behind the houses, the wooded strip wasn't large, but it swallowed light quickly. Volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder under the search sergeant's direction and stepped into the trees slowly enough to see underfoot and fast enough to feel like progress. They called small landmarks to keep the line oriented: a rusted lawn chair, a cinder block, glass bottles buried to their necks. Andrea rewrote her phone number for volunteers whose pens skipped on clipboards. Mark drifted toward the alley again and again, scanning fence boards for fresh nicks and dirt for small patterns. A detective asked him to remain near the house in case they needed a recent photo or a list of favorite places. He nodded and then moved anyway, because standing still felt like giving up inches he might need later. Close to 10, the boundary pushed to the elementary school and the drainage ditch beside it. A supervisor requested a drone team for first light. Another arranged for more K-9 units at dawn. Under a street lamp, detectives compared notes: back gates, alley access, gravel pull-off, tree line, vehicles that came and went between 7 and 8. Neighbors brought extension cords and coffee. Officers asked who had moved away recently and who kept unusual hours, and asked again about cameras. Hope on the street held because it had to. People told Andrea that children hide well, that he was clever, that he might be sleeping somewhere small. Officers did not argue. They focused on the next practical thing, and then the next. By midnight, the cul-de-sac had the dazed brightness of a place awake past reason. The tree line had been walked and marked, and the garages were clear. The dog trail ended where the gravel widened and the woods began. The map of what they knew was larger than at 7 and still nowhere near large enough. Andrea sat on the curb with a bottle of water she wasn't drinking, eyes on the alley mouth as if watching could change something. Across the street, a neighbor checked the timestamp on a porch camera clip from earlier in the evening and frowned, uncertain. A detective asked for a copy and wrote the time down. On Willow Bend Court, the work didn't stop. Somewhere in those minutes before dark, a small piece of the night had been recorded, and whatever it showed would be the next thing the street tried to understand. When detectives began collecting home security footage from the houses around Willow Bend Court, they knew most of it would be useless. Shadows in driveways, moths flickering across lenses, neighbors walking their dogs. But on the second evening of the search, a clip from a house just 2 doors down from the Merricks stood out. The camera, mounted near the front porch, had been set to record motion. At 7:10 p.m., it captured Caleb. He was wearing the blue hoodie his mother had described, the hood up despite the heat, sleeves pushed to his elbows. In his right hand, he carried a small plastic flashlight, the kind he sometimes used to make the game of hide-and-seek more exciting. What struck investigators was the way he was moving, not in the playful darting steps of a child trying to avoid being found, but in a purposeful walk, quick and focused. His eyes seemed fixed ahead, then darted back over his shoulder as if checking something behind him. In that brief glance, his face appeared tense. There was no smile, no trace of the fun that had filled the air earlier in the evening. It was what came next that unsettled everyone who saw the footage. Just at the far left of the frame, where the image blurred into shadow, a partial figure appeared. It was too far to make out, clearly, just the faint shape of a shoulder, maybe an arm, entering the shot a few seconds after Caleb passed. No face was visible, no clothing details stood out. The lighting from the porch barely reached them, and before they could be fully in view, the clip ended as Caleb moved beyond the camera's range. Detectives replayed the footage again and again, slowing it, adjusting contrast, sharpening edges. They compared the height and movement of the shadow against Caleb's own. Whoever it was seemed taller, moving at a steady pace, not running to catch up, but keeping a consistent distance. There was no obvious grab, no sudden change in speed, just a quiet, deliberate following. The next step was to determine whether the figure could be another neighborhood child. Investigators began cross-referencing the video's timestamp with the statements they'd taken the night before. They mapped out where each of the other kids claimed to be hiding and at what times they had been found. 2 were confirmed by other witnesses to have been on the opposite side of the street. 1 had been inside her house after being tagged out. Another was still hiding in a backyard shed until almost 7:20. No one placed themselves on the route Caleb was walking. Detectives checked missing person reports from surrounding towns, looking for any child who might resemble the shadowy figure, thinking there was a slim chance it could be someone else entirely. Nothing matched. There had been no other missing child alerts, no reports of runaways fitting the size and build seen on the clip. The possibility began to form that this was not another child at all. They canvassed for more footage along Caleb's path, hoping another camera might catch the pair from a different angle, but the gaps in coverage were frustrating. One home system had a dead battery. Another's data overrode itself every 24 hours, and the owner had already lost the footage from that night. A third camera caught the glow of Caleb's flashlight beam for a fraction of a second as he passed, but the angle missed the figure entirely. When police showed the video to Caleb's parents, Andrea gripped the edge of the table, staring at the blurry image as if willing it to resolve into someone she knew. Mark leaned in, asking for it to be played again, pointing at the shoulder in the corner of the frame. He said it looked too broad to belong to a kid their son's age. Detectives didn't disagree. The working theory shifted subtly that night. Until then, There had been room for the idea that Caleb had simply run off into the woods on his own, maybe gotten lost, maybe found shelter somewhere. Now, with a shadow moving behind him, the focus widened to include the possibility that someone had been with him in those last visible moments, someone who had never come forward, who was not supposed to be there. In the command post set up in a neighbor's garage, the clip was loaded onto laptops. Analysts marking the exact times. Caleb enters the frame at 7:10:14, looks over his shoulder at 7:10:17, the shadow appears at 7:10:19. By 7:10:23, both are gone from view. Less than 5 minutes later, according to all accounts, Caleb was nowhere to be found. Detectives couldn't yet say if the figure was guiding him, following him, or simply walking the same route by chance. But whatever the explanation, those 9 seconds became the most significant piece of evidence they had. And in the absence of any sound, any clear face, or any movement beyond those few frames, the question grew sharper. Who was in that shadow, and why were they behind a 9-year-old boy moments before he vanished? In the days after Caleb's disappearance, the tight, orderly search of Willow Bend Court began to unravel into a wider and far more uncertain hunt. The official line from investigators remained measured. They didn't know if Caleb had wandered off, been taken, or met with some kind of accident, but inside the neighborhood, the conversations had already split into camps. Some clung to the idea that he had simply gotten lost in the wooded strip, and, in panic, kept moving until he was beyond earshot. Others whispered about the shadow in the porch camera footage and asked why someone would be walking behind him if they weren't supposed to be there. By the end of the first week, the search perimeter had doubled. Teams moved beyond the immediate neighborhood into the larger grid of Brookdale streets, then into the surrounding parks and nature trails. Maps were taped to the walls of the temporary command post, circles expanding outward, each one representing another mile cleared. Volunteers in high-visibility vests picked their way along the edges of creeks, through drainage channels, and down the embankments of the nearby highway. Storm drains became a point of focus after an officer noted that some in the area were large enough for a child to crawl into. Public works crews joined the effort, lifting heavy grates while searchers lowered lights into the darkness below. Nothing resembling Caleb's flashlight or clothing turned up. Abandoned buildings on the edge of town, old farmhouses, a derelict storage facility, were swept room by room, their stale air and dust coating the searchers' masks. 10 days in, a volunteer approached a patrol sergeant with something they thought might be important. They claimed they had seen, on the night Caleb went missing, a man standing near a white panel van 2 streets over, speaking to a child. The description was vague. Average height, dark baseball cap, light-colored shirt. The child, they thought, could have been Caleb, but they weren't certain. Investigators canvassed the area again, pulled traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, and cross-checked it with vehicle registrations. The van was never identified, and without a plate number or a clearer sighting, the lead went nowhere. As the weeks passed, the investigation began to attract attention beyond Brookdale. Regional news crews arrived, setting up tripods in front of the Merrick's home, interviewing neighbors on sidewalks. The footage of Caleb in his blue hoodie was aired repeatedly, alongside the enhanced still of the partial shadow behind him. Reporters speculated on possible scenarios, often repeating the same limited facts, but with more urgency in their tone. Andrea and Mark gave one brief press conference on their lawn, pleading for anyone who might know something to come forward. Theories multiplied with every story shared online. Some internet forums argued that the wooded strip behind the neighborhood had been under-searched, pointing to similar cases where children were found weeks later in overlooked areas. Others were convinced the answer lay within the neighborhood itself, that someone local had taken Caleb and hidden him close by. There were even claims of a transient camp several miles away that might have harbored him, but checks of those sites turned up nothing. Inside the command post, detectives worked through a checklist that seemed to grow faster than it shrank. They re-interviewed everyone who had been outside that evening, compared timelines, and ran down lists of registered offenders in the area. Every call that came in was logged and followed up, no matter how small the tip. A pair of footprints found in soft mud near the far end of the woods turned out to belong to one of the search volunteers. A backpack spotted in the weeds near the elementary school contained only old textbooks and trash. As August turned to September, the weather began to change. The long, bright evenings gave way to earlier sunsets, and with them came the slow tightening of resources. Volunteer numbers dropped as people returned to work and school. The police department shifted personnel back to other duties, keeping only a core team on Caleb's case. The Merricks noticed the difference, the fewer cars parked along the street, the quiet that returned to their block at night. What hadn't changed was the fracture in belief. Some neighbors still swore Caleb was out there somewhere, waiting to be found, maybe surviving on instinct or the help of a stranger. Others had already resigned themselves to the idea that something irreversible had happened within minutes of his last sighting. In either case, both sides were left with the same truth. 8 weeks after a summer game of hide and seek, no one could explain how a 9-year-old boy had stepped out of sight on a familiar street and disappeared into nothing. And with the season turning, the case was sliding into the phase investigators feared most, one where the trail wasn't just cold, it was vanishing. 8 years is a long time for a case to stand still. In the immediate aftermath of Caleb's disappearance, the search had been relentless, officers moving in tight formations, volunteers filling the streets, media, cameras flashing. But as the years passed, the noise faded. Leads dried up, tips slowed to a trickle, and eventually the investigation became a file in a cabinet, opened only when something vaguely similar surfaced in another jurisdiction. There were no confirmed sightings, no anonymous letters, no calls demanding money, no discovery of clothing, bones, or anything that could be tied to him. It was as if the boy in the blue hoodie had stepped out of the frame and never returned. The Merricks held on longer than most families could. Andrea refused to change Caleb's bedroom, keeping his bed made, his books stacked in the same uneven piles, his flashlight still on the nightstand where he'd left it. Mark buried himself in work, avoiding the house until late at night. The pressure and grief bent them in different directions, and 5 years after their son vanished, they separated quietly. Andrea stayed in the house, unable to imagine sleeping anywhere else, while Mark moved across town, telling friends it was the only way he could breathe again. The town around them carried on. New families moved into Willow Bend Court, unaware of the weight the street held until a neighbor told them the story in hushed tones. Children grew up and left for college. A few yards from the edge of the woods where the scent dogs had lost Caleb's trail, a small wooden cross stood year-round, maintained by a rotation of neighbors. Some left flowers. Others tied blue ribbons to the chain-link fence nearby. On anniversaries, Andrea would stand there, watching the line of trees, wondering if they still held some piece of the truth. Every so often, the case would flare briefly back to life. A hiker finding small shoes in the woods 50 miles away, a reported sighting in another state, a man in custody for an unrelated abduction whose timeline overlapped with Caleb's. Each time, detectives checked, compared, and came back with the same answer. Not him. The false alarms wore Andrea down more than the silence, each one a brief flicker of possibility snuffed out within days. By the 8th year, Caleb's disappearance had become one of those haunting stories that locals could recite, but no longer expected to see solved. Newscasters referred to it as the Brookdale Mystery, grouping it with other cold cases in the region. The urgency that once filled the air on Willow Bend Court was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt heavier than any search siren. Then, in the spring of 2023, something shifted, not with a tip, not with a confession, but with an ordinary errand. A property inspector was sent to check on a small rental home just 1 block from where the Merricks lived. The owner had recently passed away, and the house was slated for sale. It had been empty for months, but the inspection was routine. Verify the condition, document anything that might need repair. The inspector worked through the rooms quickly, living room, kitchen, bedrooms, before heading to the backyard. There, at the far corner of the lot, was a large wooden kennel, weathered but still sturdy, its chain-link door hanging slightly askew. The current tenant had kept no pets, but the kennel remained from a previous owner. Inside, the floor was covered with loose boards. As the inspector stepped in to check for rot, one of the boards shifted underfoot, revealing a gap just wide enough to see into the darkness below. Expecting to find animal burrows or old debris, the inspector knelt and pulled the board back. What he saw instead made him stop cold, a dirt-lined hollow, large enough for a person to crawl into, with objects scattered along its edge. There was an old backpack, its fabric faded, and beside it, a pair of small sneakers, worn but still intact. On top of them sat a corroded flashlight, its casing dulled with age. The inspector stepped back and called his supervisor, who called the police. Within the hour, detectives were standing over the open panel, their expressions tight. The sneakers matched the description Andrea had given 8 years earlier, right down to the scuffed toe of the left shoe. The flashlight was the same size and shape Caleb had been carrying in the porch footage. The discovery was enough to bring the case roaring back to life. For the first time in years, the quiet on Willow Bend Court cracked. Neighbors gathered in small knots, voices low, glancing toward the house where the kennel stood. Andrea, standing in her driveway, watched the police cars line the curb again, just as they had on the night her son vanished. She didn't know yet what they would find beneath that floor, but she could feel it in her chest, that something about the long silence was about to change. In February of 2023, the complaint came in like dozens of others the Animal Control Department handled each month, dogs barking too much day and night, disturbing the neighbors. The address was familiar to the responding officer, a squat, weathered house belonging to Glenn Porter. He was a man who had lived in Brookdale for decades, but rarely spoke to anyone. Most people knew him only as the guy with the dogs, 3 large shepherd mixes that spent most of their lives in a backyard kennel. When the officer arrived, the barking was relentless, echoing off the narrow fences on either side. Porter wasn't home, and the officer, following protocol, stepped into the yard to check for signs of distress. The kennel dominated the far end of the property, an old wooden structure with a chain-link door and a patched tin roof. The dogs were pacing frantically, not at the door as animals often do when a stranger approaches, but clustered in the back corner, noses pressed to the floor. The officer's first thought was rodents, but as he stepped closer, the animals' agitation grew sharper, low growls between barks, claws scratching at the boards beneath them. Crouching down, the officer saw that one of the panels near the back had shifted slightly, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness underneath. It wasn't a gap from wear and tear. The board looked like it had been deliberately cut to fit, as though it could be removed. Curiosity edged out procedure. The officer slid the panel aside, and a stale, earthy smell rose up. Beneath it was a hollow space, maybe 3 feet deep, the sides reinforced with plywood, but the floor bare dirt. The beam from the officer's flashlight caught something in the far corner, fabric, leather, and metal dulled with corrosion. The first item pulled from the crawl space was a small, faded backpack, its zipper stiff with rust. Next came a pair of sneakers, child-sized, the soles worn down, the laces stiff and discolored. The left shoe had a small scuff on the toe, just like the one described in an 8-year-old missing persons report. Lying beside them was a flashlight, its casing corroded but unmistakably the kind sold in local stores. During the summer, Caleb Merrick vanished. The officer stopped touching anything and called it in. Within 20 minutes, the property was swarming with police and crime scene technicians. Porter returned while they were still in the yard, standing at the gate with a bewildered expression as he was met by uniformed officers. He offered no resistance as they escorted him inside for questioning. Detectives marked and photographed everything, working slowly to preserve the crawl space exactly as it had been found. The dirt floor was sifted for trace evidence. The backpack, sneakers, and flashlight were bagged separately, each sealed and labeled for forensic testing. Every inch of the kennel was examined, from the rusted hinges on the chain-link door to the patches of fresh wood reinforcing the roof. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering to one another. Some admitted later they had always thought Porter was odd, but never suspected anything like this. Others said the sight of police pulling small shoes from his yard made their stomachs turn. Inside the command post, officers compared the find to the original case file. The sneakers were nearly identical to the ones Caleb had been wearing the night he disappeared. The backpack matched a model sold in local stores that same year, though the colors had faded. The flashlight was the same size as the one seen in the porch footage, though after years underground, its batteries were long dead. Detectives couldn't yet say how long the items had been there. The crawlspace's walls showed no recent disturbance, but the wood framing the hidden panel looked newer than the rest of the kennel, suggesting it had been repaired or perhaps concealed at some point after its initial construction. That night, Andrea Merrick sat in her living room as two detectives explained what had been found. She didn't need to see photos to know they were talking about her son's belongings. She could picture the scuff on the shoe from the day he'd tripped. Running across the driveway, the frayed strap on his backpack he'd promised to stop tugging on, the flashlight he insisted on bringing outside even in daylight. The discovery didn't answer the question that had haunted her for nearly a decade. If anything, it deepened it. The kennel was less than a 5-minute walk from her house. If those items had been there all this time, then Caleb had never been far away. The street where she had searched with a flashlight, calling his name until her voice gave out, had been a single turn from the place where part of him had been hidden. And somewhere in the gap between the night he vanished and the day the barking started, someone had put them there. Glenn Porter sat in a straight-backed chair inside the small interview room at the Brookdale Police Department, his weathered hands folded neatly in front of him. At 68, he looked older than his years, deep lines across his face, a slight stoop in his posture, but his voice was firm. He told detectives he had no idea how those items ended up under his kennel. The structure, he said, had been there since he bought the property 15 years ago. He claimed he never thought to pull up the floorboards, never noticed anything hidden beneath. He insisted he didn't know anyone named Caleb Merrick. The detectives let him speak, watching his eyes as he repeated the same denials. Then they began pressing on the details. Porter said he moved to Brookdale in 2008, but property records showed the sale closing in early 2009. He claimed the kennel was built by the previous owner, though a neighbor recalled seeing him outside one summer with lumber and tools working in the yard. When asked about repairs, he admitted to replacing a few boards here and there over the years, but said it was only to keep the dogs in. Out in the evidence lab, technicians began the slow work of examining the sneakers, backpack, and flashlight. They photographed every seam, swabbed for trace DNA, and vacuumed the crawlspace for hair or fibers. Soil samples were taken from beneath the floor with the hope that sediment analysis might help determine how long the items had been buried there. Early results confirmed that at least some of the DNA on the sneakers matched Caleb's profile, which had been stored in the national database since 2015. As soon as the confirmation came through, the missing person case was formally reopened, though publicly the department kept its statements cautious. They described the discovery only as potential evidence and emphasized that no charges had been filed. Behind the scenes, however, the case file was pulled from storage and spread across the desks in the small conference room at the station. Detectives reread witness statements, redrew maps of the original search grid, and began making a new list of people to interview, many of them names that had faded from public discussion years ago. Word spread through Brookdale, faster than any official update could travel. By the next morning, the street where Porter lived was buzzing with speculation. Some residents said they'd always been wary of him, describing how he kept to himself, but seemed to watch children playing in the street. One woman remembered him standing at the edge of his property during neighborhood games, making casual remarks about how fast those kids could run. Another recalled him offering to fix a broken bicycle for her son, only for her to politely decline. Others defended him, saying he was quiet but polite, and that owning dogs explained most of his behavior. Still, the discovery under the kennel had shifted the way people looked at him. Neighbors who had once waved now crossed the street when passing his house. Parents began walking their children to the bus stop again, something they hadn't done in years. Detectives tried to pin down where Porter had been the night Caleb vanished. His version of events was vague. He said he'd been around the house, maybe gone into town for groceries, but he couldn't remember exactly. Receipts from that period were long gone, and no one could verify seeing him at the store that evening. His property had never been searched during the initial investigation, partly because he'd been outside the immediate grid of interest, and partly because, at the time, there had been no reason to suspect him. Now, officers were quietly conducting background checks, pulling court records from other counties, and looking into a decades-old charge of trespassing that had been dismissed. They noted patterns, a tendency to linger near parks, a complaint from years back about him photographing a Little League game without having a child on the team. None of it was enough to prove anything on its own, but taken together, it painted a picture that investigators couldn't ignore. For the Merricks, hearing his name was like reopening a wound that had never healed. Andrea struggled with the thought that someone so close, less than a block from her own front door, might have been tied to Caleb's disappearance. Mark said little publicly, but privately told friends he had always believed the answer was within walking distance of their house. That week, uniformed officers returned to Porter's property with a search warrant, combing through his house, shed, and yard. They carried out boxes of documents, a computer tower, and several items of clothing that would be sent for analysis. No immediate smoking gun emerged, but the evidence from the kennel remained the focal point. In the quiet moments after the search, detectives admitted to one another that the odds of finding conclusive proof after 8 years were slim. But the presence of Caleb's belongings beneath Porter's dogs was not something they could dismiss. It meant that, at some point, there had been a link between that house and a boy who had simply been playing a game of hide and seek. And, until they understood how that link was forged, the case could not rest. The evidence lab worked in silence, technicians moving methodically as they processed the sneakers, backpack, and flashlight recovered from beneath Porter's kennel. Every fiber, every fragment of soil was examined, logged, and preserved. Days later, the call came through to the lead detective. A partial DNA profile had been recovered from the inner lining of the left sneaker. The match was confirmed against Caleb Merrick's profile, which had been stored in the National Missing Persons Database since 2015. The result was definitive. Caleb had worn those shoes. It was a breakthrough, but it carried a bitter edge. The same testing found no trace of human remains in the crawl space itself, no bone fragments, no tissue. Instead, technicians recovered several long strands of hair and fibers embedded in the dirt and caught in the splintered wood along the crawlspace wall. Some fibers matched the hoodie Caleb had been wearing the night he vanished. Others appeared to be from a heavy wool material, possibly a blanket or rug, though their origin was still unknown. The evidence was enough to place him there at some point in time, but not to explain what happened afterward. Detectives turned their attention to Glenn Porter's past, digging into records that stretched back decades. What they found surprised even the veterans on the case. In 1984, Porter had been arrested in another county for unlawful confinement. The details were sparse. Most of the case file had been purged, but it involved a teenage boy who claimed Porter had locked him inside a shed for several hours. Porter denied the allegations, saying the boy had been trespassing and he was waiting for the parents to come collect him. The case was dismissed after the family declined to testify, but the arrest report remained. Further digging uncovered smaller incidents. A trespassing complaint in 1992, when Porter was found on private property near a summer camp, a police report from the late 1990s about him photographing children at a public pool without consent, and a neighbor's written statement from 2003 alleging he had tried to coax their daughter into his yard with the promise of letting her help feed the dogs. None of these incidents had resulted in convictions, but the pattern was troubling. The problem for prosecutors was that troubling wasn't enough. Without a body, a confirmed cause of death, or direct evidence tying Porter to Caleb's disappearance beyond possession of his belongings, the case remained circumstantial. Defense attorneys could argue that someone else had placed the items under the kennel, or that they had been left there years earlier without Porter's knowledge. Even the DNA, while powerful in confirming the sneakers belonged to Caleb, did not prove when or how they had ended up on Porter's property. Inside the department, the frustration was palpable. Detectives felt they were circling the truth but unable to land on it. One investigator noted that Porter's property had never been part of the original search grid, because it was just outside the immediate area mapped that first night. Another pointed out that the kennel, in plain sight, had been walked past dozens of times over the years without anyone suspecting what lay beneath it. The oversight was difficult to swallow. In the neighborhood, the news of the DNA match reignited anger and suspicion. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely now kept them within sight at all times. Old rumors resurfaced, stories about Porter's odd behavior during block parties, the way he would stand at the edge of his driveway and watch children's games without participating. A few admitted to having quietly warned their kids to stay away from his house long before any of this came to light. Detectives continued to search for anything that could bridge the gap between evidence and proof. They re-examined cold leads, hoping to find overlooked witnesses or sightings. A former tenant of the house next to Porter's was tracked down in another state and interviewed. He recalled hearing muffled noises coming from Porter's yard one summer night years ago, but had dismissed it as the dogs. Another former co-worker described Porter as quiet but always aware of where everyone was, a man who kept to himself but noticed everything. Every piece added weight to the suspicion, but the legal threshold remained out of reach. The district attorney's office was candid. Without new evidence, a witness, a confession, or the discovery of Caleb's remains, any homicide charge risked collapsing in court. And if it failed, Porter could walk free forever beyond the reach of prosecution. The reopening of the case was both a relief and a torment for the Merrick family. Andrea clung to the hope that the DNA confirmation meant they were closer to the truth. Mark, more guarded, feared it might be the last concrete link they would ever find. Both knew that what had been uncovered under the kennel proved one thing beyond doubt. Caleb had been there. But the most important questions, the ones that had haunted them for 8 years, were still unanswered. How he had gotten there, what had been done to him, and why no one had found him before. And until those answers emerged, justice was a possibility forever out of reach. The second search of Glenn Porter's property began before sunrise. Detectives had returned armed with a broader warrant, allowing them to go through every structure, every corner of the yard, and any space capable of concealing evidence. The first sweep had focused on the kennel and immediate surroundings, but now the search extended to the weathered shed that sat in the far back corner, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It was a structure Porter claimed he used only for storing tools and dog supplies, its warped door secured by an old padlock. When officers forced it open, the interior was as expected: rusted garden tools, cracked plastic tubs, and stacks of lumber leaning against one wall. But when a crime scene technician began clearing debris from the dirt floor near the shed's foundation, their trowel struck something metallic. Brushing away the soil revealed a small, rusted tin box, no larger than a lunch container. Its surface was mottled with corrosion, the hinges stiff from years underground. The box was carefully lifted onto a clean tarp before being pried open. Inside, beneath a thin layer of dust, was a single sheet of paper folded into quarters. It was yellowed, soft at the creases, and smelled faintly of damp earth. The pencil markings were faded but legible, uneven letters that tilted in different directions, the kind of handwriting seen in elementary school notebooks. The message was short, written in 2 lines. "If you find this, I was here. My name is Caleb." The shed fell silent as the words were read aloud. A photographer documented the note in place, capturing every detail before it was carefully placed into an evidence bag. Forensic specialists would later attempt to date the graphite and paper, but the results would be inconclusive. Exposure to soil and moisture had degraded the materials too much to provide a reliable time frame. It could have been written the week Caleb vanished, or months later. There was no way to know. When detectives brought the note to Andrea Merrick, she stared at it for a long time without speaking. Her hands trembled as she traced the uneven letters through the clear plastic sleeve. She recognized the way her son wrote his name, the looping L and the backward E he had only recently learned to correct. The realization hit her with crushing force. This wasn't just proof that Caleb had been on Porter's property. It was a message, one that suggested he had been alive for at least some period after disappearing. The thought that he might have been so close, possibly held somewhere within shouting distance of home, was almost too much to bear. Porter was taken into custody that afternoon for questioning. In the interview room, he sat across from two detectives who placed the note on the table between them. They asked how it had ended up buried under his shed, alongside a rusted box that bore the marks of long-term concealment. Porter denied ever seeing it before. He said anyone could have placed it there over the years, that the shed wasn't locked for much of the time he'd owned the property. When pressed about the message itself, he shrugged, insisting he had no idea what it meant and no reason to harm a child. The detectives pointed out that the shed was within the fenced boundary of his yard, an area not visible from the street. They reminded him of the sneakers, the backpack, and the flashlight found under his kennel just days earlier. Porter's only response was to repeat that he didn't know how any of it got there. As the interview stretched on, they shifted to his movements in the days following Caleb's disappearance, but his answers remained vague. He couldn't remember details, where he had gone, who he had spoken to, or what he had done. When asked about the possibility that someone else had been on his property without his knowledge, he offered no names, no theories. He simply said, "Things end up places they don't belong all the time." For investigators, the note was both a breakthrough and a torment. It confirmed Caleb had been on the property in a way no other piece of evidence had. But without knowing when it was written or under what circumstances, it stopped short of proving the critical link between Porter and whatever fate had befallen the boy. The district attorney's office reviewed the case again, weighing the note alongside the other evidence. The handwriting could be matched to Caleb's schoolwork, but without forensic dating, the defense could argue it had been planted. In the neighborhood, the discovery was all anyone could talk about. Some saw it as undeniable proof of Porter's guilt. Others, wary of legal technicalities, feared it still wouldn't be enough to bring justice. Parents kept their children indoors. People who had once walked past Porter's house without a thought now crossed the street, avoiding even the sight of the yard. That night, Andrea sat at her kitchen table with the note in front of her, the image printed from the evidence photo. She read the words over and over, imagining her son in whatever place he had been when he wrote them. The message was clear, yet it left her with more questions than answers. Somewhere in that shed's shadowed corner, her son had left behind the only trace of his voice in 8 years, and the man who lived there still refused to say why. In the end, the case against Glenn Porter never became what investigators had hoped it would be. The DNA on the sneakers, the fibers matching Caleb's clothing, the rusted tin box with the note, and the inconsistencies in Porter's own statements all painted a picture that looked damning. But in court, pictures without the missing pieces don't always hold. Without a body, a confirmed cause of death, or a direct witness, prosecutors knew they could not guarantee a homicide conviction. Instead, the charges leveled against Porter were obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. Serious, but a far cry from what Caleb's family had wanted to see. Porter was transferred to county jail to await trial. Inmates and guards alike knew about the case. It was the kind of story that seeped through walls long before paperwork caught up. He remained mostly silent, speaking little to other prisoners, refusing media requests, and giving no further statements to police. The only thing he repeated, whenever asked, was that he was innocent. But his health was failing. At 68, with a history of heart problems and untreated diabetes, he grew weaker as the months passed. 8 months after his arrest, before the trial could begin, Porter collapsed in his cell. Paramedics attempted to revive him, but he was pronounced dead at the county hospital. For investigators, his death was less an ending than another wall slamming shut. Whatever answers he might have given, if he had ever been willing to give them, died with him. The legal file was closed, but the case itself remained open. Caleb's remains had never been found. There was no grave to visit, no certainty about his final moments. For Andrea and Mark Merrick, the loss felt doubled. Not only had they been denied the truth, but the one person who might have been able to provide it was gone. Andrea said later that she had held on to a quiet hope, even after years of silence, that if the police could just confront Porter with enough evidence, he might finally tell her where to find her son. Now, that hope was gone. In the weeks after Porter's death, his property was emptied and sold at auction. The kennel where Caleb's belongings had been found was dismantled piece by piece. Its panels were taken away as evidence, though nothing new was recovered from them. The patch of earth where it had stood was left bare, just a rectangle of disturbed soil in an otherwise unremarkable yard. But neighbors noticed something strange. The dogs, now rehomed, had spent years barking at that one corner of the kennel. Even after the structure was gone, people walking past claimed they sometimes still heard other dogs in the area growl or bark when they reached that spot, as if responding to something unseen. The community remained divided on what exactly had happened. Some believed Porter had kept Caleb alive for a time after the disappearance, perhaps even letting him roam parts of the property before hiding him away. Others clung to the idea that Caleb had managed to escape, only to die somewhere else, far from where anyone had searched. That theory offered a small measure of comfort. At least he hadn't died in the hands of the man suspected of taking him. But it also left the haunting question of how close he had been to freedom. A few residents suggested the possibility that Porter hadn't acted alone, that someone else had been involved either in taking Caleb or in hiding his belongings on the property. Detectives didn't dismiss it entirely. The evidence left enough gaps to make room for such speculation. But with Porter gone and no new suspects emerging, the investigation's momentum slowed. Today, the Merrick home still stands on Willow Bend Court. Caleb's bedroom, though dustier than it once was, remains untouched. On the edge of the woods where the trail went cold that first night, the small wooden cross is still there, its paint faded by rain and sun. Each year on the anniversary of his disappearance, neighbors leave flowers or ribbons, and someone always places a small flashlight at its base. The story of Caleb Merrick has become part of the town's identity, a mystery woven into its streets and backyards. The police files describe it in evidence tags and chain of custody forms, but for the people who lived it, the case is a living wound. Porter's kennel may be gone, the earth beneath it smoothed over, but the questions it left behind still bite at those who remember. Some believe the truth is out there, buried deeper than anyone has dug. Others believe it's already been taken to the grave. And for the Merricks, the absence of an answer has become its own kind of sentence, one that will last until the day they know with certainty where their son is.